Two people were sitting in the noisy cafe hall. One of them, a retired detective, was studying a map. His hands moved slowly over the worn paper, on which the places were neatly marked. They all seemed ordinary: parks, old buildings, bridges. However, in each of these places, strange events have occurred in recent years that no one could explain. "You know, it's just a rumor," said his interlocutor, a pale-faced young reporter who took on such a case for the first time in his life. "There are no paranormal phenomena, it's all fiction." "Rumors don't come out of nowhere," the detective replied warily, without looking up from the map. "Each of these cases has an explanation. People are afraid of the unknown, and when they can't understand it, they make up stories for themselves. But there is something real behind each of them, and much scarier than any ghosts." The young reporter did not yet know what he was going to see. He was told that these places were full of paranormal rumors, but the detective convinced him that the answers to all their questions would turn out to be real. But sometimes reality is much more terrible than the most terrible inventions. They decided to start their investigation with one of the most famous places, a hotel on the outskirts of the city. The old building had not been renovated for several decades, and you could hear someone's footsteps in each of its rooms, even if no one was in it. People claimed that at night the doors opened by themselves, and children's laughter could be heard in the corridors. The guests left the hotel at night without waiting for morning, and no one could explain what exactly they saw. When they arrived at the place, the hotel looked abandoned. The windows of the second floor were boarded up, the roof was crumbling, and the signboard, which once proudly indicated the name, now hung on one hinge, threatening to break with the first strong wind. The reporter looked at the detective and felt goosebumps running down his skin. How can anyone stay here? It flashed through his mind. It was even worse inside. Dust hung in the air, and there was a smell of dampness and something rotting. Broken bottles lay on the floor, and cobwebs and traces of long-forgotten things were hidden in the corners. They headed to the reception desk, where, surprisingly, there was only one work phone that was not turned off. The detective examined him carefully and then picked up the phone. In less than a few seconds, a noise was heard on the other end of the line. Quiet, whispering voices. It seemed to the reporter that this was a taped trick used by the hotel owners to scare the guests. But the detective gave him a look that said, "There's something wrong here." They decided to explore the rooms, starting with the most frequently mentioned in tourist reviews. In one of them, according to visitors, the walls were knocking at night, and the light itself turned on and off. When they entered, an ordinary room appeared in front of them. A bed, a table, a couple of chairs, an old wardrobe. Nothing special. The reporter was about to joke that their frustration was growing when he suddenly heard a knock. Soft, but clear. "It's the wind," he said, trying to convince himself. But the knock was repeated. Now on the other side. The detective got up and walked over to the wall. He ran his hand over its surface and then knocked himself. The response was immediate, and this response was no ordinary echo. It seemed that someone was answering from inside the wall. They took apart part of the skin to understand what was going on. When they managed to pull out some rotten planks, their gaze fell on an old ventilation shaft covered with a rusty grate. The reporter put his hand in there, trying to get something that glittered there. When his fingers brushed the metal, he heard a muffled scream. The detective yanked him back and then looked inside the shaft with a flashlight. Inside, in the narrow passage, something was moving. They clearly saw a hand emerge from the darkness, withered and twisted. The ventilation was too narrow for anyone to pass through, but clearly someone was there. "It's not perfume," the detective said, not looking away. "It's much worse." The detective was in no hurry to move away from the vent. His face remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. The reporter staggered back, trying to cope with the wave of panic that swept over him at the sight of that hand. "What was that?" he whispered, as if he was afraid that the creature would hear. The detective stood up slowly, his attention focused on the wall. "A man," he said shortly, brushing the dust off his knees. "A man? But how? There's no place for anyone to pass through. Not everyone follows the standard routes." The detective looked at the reporter, his tone becoming more tense. I think there are people hiding in this hotel. Maybe a long time ago. Perhaps someone is being held against their will. The reporter frowned, not understanding what his partner was talking about. But why? Who's going to keep someone in the vent? The detective did not respond immediately. Instead, he went to the door leading to the hallway and examined the jamb, then ran his finger along the handle. It seemed to him that it was chafed, as if someone was constantly tugging at it, trying to open it. A second later, he lifted to his eyes a small piece of paper stuck in the gap between the door and the jamb. "A note," he said softly, as if to himself, and unfolded the piece of paper. There were only 2 words written on it: "Help us." Smooth, neat letters, as if they were written by a man who no longer had the strength for long explanations. The reporter came closer, peering over the detective's shoulder. His breathing became ragged. Maybe this is a prank? His voice sounded uncertain. The detective clenched the piece of paper in his fist. This is not a joke. There's something going on here. They began to inspect the building further. Along the way, there were rooms where things were abandoned in a hurry. Half-eaten dinners, scattered clothes, overturned chairs. Everything indicated that people were leaving these premises suddenly, as if something had scared them off. The detective moved slowly through the corridors, noting the strange details. For example, in some rooms the walls were incredibly thin, as if there was nothing behind them, and in others the sound strangely faded, as if something was absorbing the sound. He noticed that each of these places had its own small, almost imperceptible passage in the walls or ceiling. At first glance, they might have been ventilation shafts or secret passages, but they were all narrow, as if designed for someone small and flexible. They came across an elevator, which, oddly enough, was still working. The detective pressed a button, and the doors slid open with a soft screech. The cabin was small, covered with dust and rust. Inside, there was a feeling that no one had used it for a long time, but despite this, it seemed somehow functional. They decided to go down to the basement. The basements of old buildings were often places where the darkest history was hidden. When the elevator doors opened on the lower floor, they were immediately enveloped in a thick smell of rot. It was damp, cold, and strangely quiet. After walking a few steps, they noticed a narrow door at the end of the corridor. It looked new, unlike the rest of the building, which immediately caught their attention. "I think we'll find the answers here," the detective said quietly, without taking his eyes off the door. They came closer. There was no lock on the door, just an ordinary wooden handle. The detective slowly pulled it towards him, and the door gave way with unexpected ease. Inside there was a room that did not correspond in any way to the general architecture of the building. It was a small room, dimly lit by a single dim lantern. Maps and diagrams hung on the walls, and stacks of documents lay on the table. However, that wasn't the strangest thing in the room. In the corner, next to a massive wardrobe, there was a small bed on which a girl was lying. Her hands were tied and her mouth was taped shut, but her eyes were open. She stared at them in horror, not making a single movement, as if she was afraid that any movement would cause something terrible. The detective quickly jumped up to her, freeing her hands and tearing the tape from her mouth. She began to breathe convulsively, not yet knowing if she was saved or if this was a new nightmare. The reporter stood nearby, shocked by what was happening, his face even paler than before. "Who kept you here?" the detective asked, kneeling down next to the bed. The girl started to speak, but her voice was weak and trembling. They're still here," she whispered. "They're hiding behind the walls." It seemed to the reporter that his heart had stopped. These words echoed in his head, increasing the fear of what else awaits them in this place. "Who are they?" the detective asked again, but the girl just shook her head. Her voice was almost inaudible. "I only heard their voices. They're watching when we're not looking. They move when we sleep. They never show up." The detective frowned, digesting what he had heard. He understood that this was not a mentally unstable victim, but a person who had experienced something terrible. He stood up and began to inspect the walls. Everywhere he looked, there were these narrow passages and vents. The silence in the room intensified, as if the building itself was listening to their conversation. And then there was a sound, a quiet rustle behind the wall. The reporter shuddered, his eyes darted towards the source of the sound, and the girl covered her face with her hands, trying not to look. The detective slowly walked up to the wall, put his hand on the cold surface, and knocked 3 times. There was no response. But after a moment, the sound returned. Now it was coming from behind the door leading to the hallway. The rustling grew louder, as if someone was scratching from the other side, trying to get inside. The detective turned to the reporter and nodded in the direction of the girl. His voice sounded confident, but there was tension in his eyes. Right now, the detective quickly jumped to the door, but the moment his hand touched the handle, the rustling outside turned into loud bangs, as if something or someone was desperately trying to enter. The girl sitting on the bed gave a strangled cry, and the reporter took a step back, his face twisted in fear. "What is it?" The reporter almost shouted, his voice trembling. The detective, ignoring the panic, took hold of the door handle and opened it with a sharp movement. The corridor was empty. Only the faint sound of echoing footsteps or movement, as if the air vibrated from someone's presence, came from afar. He looked around, peering intently into the gloom. "We can't stay here," the detective said, his voice becoming resolute. "If they can move through these shafts and passages, then we can be surrounded. We have to get out." The reporter nodded, unable to find the words. He knew that something inexplicable was happening, but he couldn't quite believe it. Fear and logic were fighting inside him, but at that moment, fear was beginning to win out. The detective helped the girl to her feet. She could barely stand. Her body was shaking, but she didn't complain. Her gaze was fixed on the corridor outside the door, where, as it seemed to her, those who were watching them were hiding. They cautiously left the room. The detective went first, keeping his hand on his belt, where his gun was. The reporter brought up the rear of their small procession, constantly looking over his shoulder. The corridor seemed endless. Its walls were scuffed, in places covered with mold, and the floor was strewn with debris and dust, which billowed with every step. They had passed several doors when the reporter heard that rustle again. This time the sound was closer, clearer, and came directly from behind the wall. He froze, his heart began to pound faster. It's them again," he whispered, pointing at the wall. The detective stopped and listened intently. The rustle was as if someone was slowly, almost silently sliding behind the wall, moving along the corridor. He stepped up to the wall, put his palm up and listened. The movement continued. "They're watching us," the detective said. "Perhaps they move in these mines or secret passages. But who are they?" The girl looked at them anxiously, her eyes full of horror. "I do not know who they are. I've never seen their faces. I just heard them whispering outside the walls. We couldn't leave. They wouldn't let us out." The detective nodded and took a step forward, deciding not to waste time thinking. They continued down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the void. But the further they went, the closer the sound got. Now the rustling was coming not only from the side of the wall, but also from above, from the ventilation holes. It became clear that their pursuers were following them. "Hurry up," the detective ordered, quickening his pace. The corridor led them to the stairs. It led up to the first floor. As they climbed the stairs, they could hear the rustling getting louder and more chaotic. It was as if they were surrounded from all sides. When they reached the first floor, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence fell on them like a weight. They were standing in a long, narrow hall that led to the exit. For a moment, it seemed to everyone that the danger was over. But the detective did not relax. His instincts told him that something was wrong. He took a step toward the exit, his hand on the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. "It's locked," he said, clenching his teeth. The reporter went to the window, which was the only source of dim light in the hall. He pulled on the frame, but the window wouldn't open. There were traces of old Scotch tape and dirty stains on the glass. Attempts to open the window only caused a thud, which made it seem that the whole building was beginning to come to life again. And suddenly, the detective heard the sound again. But this time, it came not from behind the wall, but from behind the door they were trying to open. Rustling, scratching, as if someone outside was also trying to enter. The detective stepped back, his hand reaching for his gun, ready for what might happen. The reporter froze, Listening to the sounds, his face turned pale, and the girl pressed against the wall again, holding back sobs. "We're trapped," she said, her voice filled with despair. When the last lights went out, the hall was plunged into pitch darkness. The reporter pressed himself convulsively against the wall, trying to suppress the growing panic. The detective, holding his gun at the ready, peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. The girl was crying quietly in the corner, her sobs barely audible, but filling the void around them. The rustling came again, but now it was everywhere. The sound was coming from different directions, from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Something was crawling, moving, and squeezing them in its invisible grip. The detective took a few steps forward, pointing the gun in the direction where he thought the pursuers might be. But before he could fire, something shrilly clicked behind him. There was a thud as the reporter collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with horror. The detective turned around, trying to figure out what had happened, but he could barely make out the silhouettes in the dark. The girl was no longer crying. Her quiet sobbing stopped. He took a step towards her, but suddenly froze when he heard light, almost noiseless footsteps behind him. Something cold touched his neck. He started and turned around, but saw no one. Nevertheless, the rustling continued. It was here, nearby. But who or what remained a mystery. At the last moment, his realization came too late. Something quickly slid over his legs, pulling them out from under him, causing him to fall to the floor. The gun flew out of his hands, rolled into the darkness, and disappeared. He tried to get up, but couldn't. Something was holding him down, squeezing his body and preventing him from moving. The rustling grew louder, turning into a growing hum. It wasn't just a sound, it was something more. It was in the walls, under the floor, in every corner of this damn building, and it came for them. The last thing he heard before everything went completely silent was a faint whisper coming from the darkness. "We are always here." And then darkness came. None of them left the hotel. When the search teams arrived the next morning, they found the building empty, abandoned, and quiet. Everyone who entered it disappeared without a trace. Things were scattered as if abandoned in a hurry, but there were no signs of people. There were rumors that those who entered this place could hear strange rustles and whispers, but no one knew what was really hiding behind the walls. The building was empty, but the rustling continued to sound, and everyone who approached began to hear them. Those who were still hiding behind the walls.